Welcome back to Riley's Rundowns. Today we will be talking about the Industrial Revolution in AP US history. Let's get started. So this will be part one of this video, which will focus on the bigger pictures and the start of the Industrial Revolution, which is also called the Gilded Age in the United States. So sources of industrial growth begin with railroads, which kick-started the Industrial Revolution. They greatly developed after the Civil War. So we have a bunch of transcontinental railroads in the United States. In 1862, we have the Union Pacific Railroad, which was commissioned to build a railroad from east to west. And then we also have the Central Pacific Railroad, which was to be built from west to east. So for the Union Pacific Railroad, 20 square miles of land was given for every 1 mile of track built for the railroad. This led to the credit mobilier scandal, which we will get to later. And this railroad was mostly built by Irish Paddies. For the Central Pacific Railroad, they had the same incentives of the Union Pacific Railroad, however, they did have less corruption. This railroad, however, was built by mostly Chinese immigrants rather than the Irish Paddies that built the Union Pacific Railroad. Four other transcontinental railroads that were built by 1900 include the North Pacific Railroad, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroads, the South Pacific Railroad, and the Great Northern Railroad. Along with railroads, we have Cornelius Vanderbilt, who was a former steamboater who made one of the New York Central railroads, and he financed a very successful Western Railroad. So some advancements in railroads include the steel rail, which was stronger and more enduring than the iron rail. We also have better brakes, which increased safety. We also had luxury passenger cars, such as the Pullman Palace cars. We also had telegraphs, a standardized gauge, time zones, and however, though, there was a lot of train accidents still. In this time, there was a lot of corruption, specifically with railroads. So we have the credit mobilier scandal. We also have Jay Gould, who made millions of embezzling stocks. There was also stock watering, which was where railroad companies would overinflate the worth of their stock and then sell them with huge profits going back to them. Railroad owners would bribe judges and legislatures. They would employ lobbyists and elect people that would help them into office. And then they would also gain the favor of the press by giving them free passes. Next, we have the Bessemer process, which converted iron into steel for mass production. This was used by Carnegie for mass production. This steel was used in railroads, construction, and a lot of other things, specifically for skyscrapers. We also have oil, which was originally used in lamps as kerosene, and Samuel Andrews would perfect the refining process of oil. Next, we have Henry Ford, who made cars affordable through the assembly line, and he raised the wages for his workers. Next, we have Taylorism, which was created by Frederick Taylor, where he subdivided tasks so that unskilled workers could be used, which made workers more interchangeable. And this made workers lose their sense of humanity because it created monotonous work that was really repetitive. So just maybe hammering something in one time and then it would move on to someone else. Hammer, move on. Hammer, move on. Just very monotonous. We also have the invention of corporations where groups of stockholders would own a business, which created limited liability, where the company would become the thing that would be in charge of taking liability rather than the individual stockholders losing something. Along with this, we have vertical integration, where a company would own all aspects of production, including land, labor, capital, etc. And then there's also horizontal integration, which is basically having a monopoly where a business owns everything in a similar industry. So owning all of the things that make zippers for our jeans kind of thing. That is a monopoly. That would be horizontal integration. We also have cartels where individual businesses would agree to make prices. That is illegal today. Holding companies were also created, which would buy up the stocks in a company and gain a lot of power inside of a company. This can be seen in JP Morgan. In this time, we have the creation of social Darwinism, which was where Darwin's ideas were applied to humans. So it advocated for the survival of the fittest, but with humans, and business owners would use this to their advantage, and it justified their wealth and their predatory business practices and their abuses of labor. We also have the Gospel of Wealth, which was written by Carnegie. It said that the wealthy should donate money to the community, and that's really where a lot of those schools that were named after these big business owners and stuff like that came about. So we have Carnegie, who created Carnegie Hall and Carnegie Mellon and stuff like that. So limits on the industry include a couple of court cases. So we have Munn versus Illinois, which occurred in 1877, where state governments said that they could regulate industries when it was in the best interest of the public. We also have the Wabash case in 1886, where yet again, the states cannot regulate interstate commerce, and this overturned the Munn decision that was made before. We also have the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887, which created the Interstate Commerce Commission and outlawed higher rates on short hauls rather than long hauls. And it also said that railroads must publish their rates. We also have the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890, which was more symbolic than anything else, and its purpose was basically to break up trusts. So with the Industrial Revolution, we have to talk about the lives of the actual workers. So the working conditions were really dangerous, and there was a lot of pollutant materials and stuff like that. There were really long days, so they would work 12 hours each day, 6 days a week. There was a lot of monotonous work, so people would doze off because not only was it monotonous and boring, but they also weren't getting a lot of sleep. So as you can imagine, that would lead to accidents. So if they're working and fall asleep with something that might be a dangerous material, hand gets chopped off, there you go. And that would be a problem because they were unskilled laborers, and that meant that a person with no hand wasn't really useful for the industrial owners. So they would be fired and someone else would be hired. Women and children at this time were also working in the Industrial Revolution. There was cheaper pay for their unskilled labor. Textile industries had the most women, and mining industries had the most children. So key inventions of the Industrial Revolution, we have sewing machines, which meant that sewing was not in the home anymore, and it was more in factories and in stores. We have the refrigerator rail car, which impacted the farming and cattle industry. We also have unions, which in most cases, the government sided with the industry rather than unions. One of these unions is the National Labor Union, which was created in 1886, and this was the first national labor union. It did, however, exclude women and African Americans. We also have the Knights of Labor, which were created in 1869, which was allowed for all workers, including men, women, African Americans, skilled laborers, and unskilled laborers. The membership in the Knights of Labor increased a lot under Terence Powderly, who was in their leadership in 1879. Unions were greatly hurt because of the Haymarket Square, which occurred in 1886. This was a riot where a bomb went off mysteriously and they didn't know where it came from, so unions were seen as dangerous. We also have the American Federation of Labor, or the AFL, which was created in 1886. This was created by Samuel Gompers, but only skilled laborers were allowed, and they really said that women should stay in home, and they greatly focused on bread and butter issues, which included better pay, better hours, and better working conditions in total. Along with unions, we have strikes. So we have the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. A railroad cut the pay of its workers by 10% because of deflation, and Hayes had to order troops to stop the strike. Hundreds died, and it shows the government's willingness to intervene in strikes. We also have the Homestead Strike, or the Lockout, of 1892, where Carnegie and Henry Clay Frick wanted to break a union at Homestead, and Frick decided to cut the wages, and the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers refused to work for these prices. Because of this, the plant was shut down, Pinkertons were called in, and they were let go when the fighting was over. Governor of Pennsylvania actually had to break down the strike with the National Guard. Next, we have the Pullman Strike of 1894, where the Pullman Palace Car Company cut wages, and they didn't cut the rent in their towns though. So the American Railway Union went on strike. During this time, there were a lot of changes in politics. So the Republicans were mostly Northern Protestants, middle class, African Americans, business owners, and they wanted high tariffs. The Democrats were mostly Catholics, immigrants, poor workers, Southerners, and they wanted lower tariffs. Key terms at this time involved in politics, you have these stalwarts, which were Republicans that favored patronage, half-breeds, which were Republicans that favored reform in the government, and the Republicans at this time were really divided. Next, we have Grant's administration. So Grant had a lot of scandals and corruption when he was in his presidency. So we have the credit mobilier issue where the Union Pacific Railroad Company created bogus contracts to make a lot of money. We also have the whiskey ring where government officials created false tax reports. Distillers made more than they claimed and paid bribes. We also have the Panic of 1873, which was the worst depression of the century to that point, and it began over investing into railroads. Debtors favored printing paper money, and they wanted to do this because they thought that it would increase the money supply, which would cause inflation and make it easier to pay off their debts. We also have the Specie Resumption Act of 1873, and this was where a new certification based on gold, and it would eliminate greenbacks. This angered the soft money supporters and made the Republicans favored hard money. We also have the election of 1876 where Hayes won. He supported the freedmen's rights and got elected from the Compromise of 1877. He supported businesses and tariffs, and he was the one who sent the troops to the Great Railroad Strike in 1877, and he supported the gold standard and was against silver coinage. In the election of 1880, Garfield won. Arthur was chosen as Garfield's vice president, so after Garfield died, Arthur became president. And he created the Pendleton Act of 1883, which created a civil service exam, which would make merit-based patronage rather than just getting a job in the government, which did decrease a lot of corruption in the government. He also signed the Tariff Act of 1883, which angered the Southerners and the Northerners, and he also signed the first Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. Lastly, we have the election of 1884, which was Cleveland versus Blaine, and this had a lot of dirty campaigning. Cleveland eventually would win, which he was a part of the Democrats, and he was a very laissez-faire president. He won the support of the half-breds, and he lost in the 1888 election to Harrison, but he actually won in 1892, which is kind of cool. In all, politics during the Industrial Revolution, tariffs were the most debated issue that separated the Republicans and the Democrats.